When Jake, a humble contractor, sets out to impress his girlfriend's elite and judgmental family over dinner, an unexpected encounter with a stranger on a broken porch delays him. What begins as a simple act of kindness soon spirals into a powerful confrontation that will test relationships, reveal hidden ties, and redefine what it truly means to belong. Before we dive into this emotional journey of judgment, redemption, and unexpected family twists, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single story that hits you right in the heart. Jake had been dating Caroline for almost a year, and things between them were great, until the subject of her parents came up. Caroline came from old money. Her father was a venture capitalist with a 6-car garage, and her mother was known in their social circle as a perfectionist with a sharp tongue and even sharper standards. Jake, on the other hand, was a self-employed contractor. He fixed houses, repaired decks, and handled anything that involved a hammer, a wrench, and hard work. He didn't wear suits. He didn't go to prep school. And although Caroline loved him for his grounded nature, her parents didn't even try to hide their disapproval. When Caroline finally convinced them to meet Jake over a formal family dinner, she made one thing clear. Please, just don't be late, and try to look presentable. Jake understood. He even took the day off work to make sure he could shower, shave, and arrive on time. He knew how much this meant to Caroline, and deep down, even though he didn't admit it, he wanted to impress her parents, not with money or status, but with respect and sincerity. He rehearsed how he'd shake her father's hand, what kind of small talk he'd make with her mother, and how to politely answer inevitable questions about his career path. Jake bought a clean button-up shirt and a second-hand blazer just for the occasion. That morning, as he was driving his beat-up pickup through the winding suburban streets toward the address Caroline had given him, a mansion with a circular driveway in the ritziest part of town, he felt a tightness in his chest. This dinner was a test, and even if he didn't believe in their values, he knew it could affect his future with Caroline. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. Just 10 blocks from Caroline's house, Jake noticed an elderly woman struggling on the front porch of a charming but worn-down home. One side of the wooden deck had collapsed under her weight. She sat on the steps, rubbing her ankle, clearly shaken but refusing to cry. Jake's first instinct was to pull over. He wasn't sure what made him do it. Maybe it was her age, or the fact that no one else seemed to stop. Maybe it was simply who he was, but stopping would mean being late. Being late meant confirming everything Caroline's parents already believed about him. Still, he parked the truck and approached her slowly. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, kneeling beside her. She looked up, surprised, then nodded. "I just wanted to sweep the porch, but it gave out on me," she muttered. "Should have fixed it years ago." Jake checked her ankle. It wasn't broken, just bruised. He helped her into a chair and examined the structure. The entire side was rotting. Anyone could have fallen through. "I can fix it," he said, almost without thinking. "Won't take long if you've got some tools." She looked at him, her eyes softening. "You're an angel," she said. "There's a toolbox in the shed. I'll get you lemonade." He didn't tell her he was on his way to the most important dinner of his life. He didn't mention Caroline or her parents. He just went to work, tearing off the broken planks, reinforcing the structure, cutting new boards to size. He worked fast, but carefully. His hands, calloused and skilled, moved with the rhythm of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. The sun dipped lower in the sky. Sweat soaked through his shirt. Sawdust clung to his arms and face. By the time he finished, the porch was safer than it had ever been. The old woman insisted on paying him. He refused. She insisted on a sandwich. He accepted. As he finally got back into his truck and looked at the time, his heart sank. He was already 30 minutes late. Caroline had texted twice. He hadn't seen the notifications. "I'm on my way," he typed quickly, then hit the gas. He had no idea what kind of storm was waiting for him. Jake's truck rumbled up the long, cobblestone driveway an hour after the agreed dinner time. The sun was nearly gone, and the lights of the massive estate cast a golden glow on the pristine hedges and expensive sports cars. He caught a glimpse of himself in the side mirror and winced. His shirt was wrinkled and stained with sweat. There was sawdust in his hair, and a fresh splinter reddened the side of his palm. He debated turning back. Every rational instinct told him it was too late to recover the night, that no one inside that house would understand why he had stopped, and certainly not care about the kindness he'd offered a stranger. But he wasn't the kind of man to ghost his responsibilities, even if they came with a side of humiliation. He straightened his shoulders and rang the doorbell. A butler, an actual butler, answered the door and gave him a once-over that said everything. Seconds later, Caroline appeared, her smile tight and eyes wide with anxiety. "Jake, where have you been?" she hissed in a whisper. Before he could answer, her mother floated into view behind her, dressed in pearls and perfectly pressed silk. "So this is the man we've heard so much about," she said, her eyes sweeping Jake from head to toe with a glint of disdain. "Fashionably late and dressed for demolition." Jake extended his hand. "I apologize for being late, ma'am. I ran into someone who needed help." Caroline's mother didn't take his hand. She gave a tight-lipped smile and turned away. "Dinner is served," she said curtly, walking back into the house. Caroline looked at Jake apologetically, but said nothing. Jake followed them into the dining room, a long, elegant table set with crystal glasses, shining cutlery, and place settings that probably cost more than his rent. Caroline's father was already seated, sipping from a glass of scotch. "Nice of you to join us," he said dryly. "We were beginning to think you got lost on a job site." Jake sat down, conscious of the dried sweat on his neck. He tried to explain. "I saw an elderly woman whose porch collapsed. She could have been seriously hurt. I couldn't just leave her there." Her father raised an eyebrow. "So you chose a stranger over your commitment to our daughter?" Jake didn't answer. Caroline stayed quiet, staring at her plate. The meal was exquisite. Roast duck, truffle potatoes, and some kind of imported vegetable Jake couldn't name. But the atmosphere was suffocating. Every question thrown his way was laced with condescension. "How long do you plan to keep working with your hands? What's your long-term vision? Or are you more of a day-by-day type? Have you ever considered a real career?" Jake responded as calmly as he could, explaining that he ran his own contracting business, had steady clients, and took pride in building things people needed. But no matter what he said, it was twisted into a punchline. Caroline's mother mentioned a yacht party they'd attended, just to contrast their usual social circles with the company Jake was clearly used to. At one point, Caroline excused herself to take a call, leaving Jake alone with her parents. Her mother leaned forward with a tight smile. "You seem like a nice young man, but you must understand we have expectations. Caroline was raised a certain way. We worry about, lifestyle compatibility." Jake clenched his jaw but didn't lash out. He wasn't surprised by the hostility, but it hurt more than he thought it would. He'd expected some awkwardness. He hadn't expected to be treated like a stain on their polished life. When Caroline returned, she looked pale. "Sorry, just work stuff," she murmured. Jake shot her a look. He knew it wasn't work. It was the pressure. The silence that followed was heavy, and Jake debated whether he should cut the evening short. Just as he was about to make an excuse to leave, headlights swept across the dining room windows. A sleek black car pulled into the driveway. Her mother frowned. "Who is that?" she muttered. No one was expecting another guest. The butler answered the door, and moments later, an elegant older woman entered the room with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need an introduction. Jake's eyes widened. He rose slowly from his chair. It was her. The woman with the broken porch. But she wasn't in a house dress anymore. She wore a deep navy suit jacket, her silver hair pulled back in a chignon, and pearls that rivaled her daughter's. "Well, well," she said, looking around. "Quite the party." Caroline's mother froze. "Mother?" she said, her voice tight. The old woman gave her a dry smile. I thought I'd drop in. Had a rather interesting day, you see. Met a man who reminded me what decency looks like. Jake stood speechless as the pieces fell into place. The room fell into stunned silence as the elegant older woman removed her gloves and set them delicately on the table. Jake was still standing, visibly shocked. Caroline's mother blinked several times, her expression cycling rapidly from confusion to recognition to something close to dread. You're the woman I helped, Jake finally said, almost in disbelief. The older woman gave him a soft, proud smile. Yes, dear. And you're the young man who stopped his own plans to help an old lady he didn't know, sweating under the sun with no expectation of reward. That kind of kindness is rare these days. She turned to her daughter, who remained frozen in place, jaw clenched. Marianne, when was the last time you lifted a finger for someone without calculating what you'd get in return? Caroline's mother bristled, her voice cold and tight. Mother, this isn't the time. Oh, I think it's exactly the time, the older woman said, her tone calm but razor-sharp. You've always judged people by their bank accounts and business cards. I thought age would soften you, but clearly, your manners have only sharpened in the wrong direction. Caroline's father cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. Evelyn, we're trying to have dinner. Could we maybe discuss this? Evelyn raised a hand and silenced him with nothing more than a look. I watched this young man rebuild a porch with care, skill, and patience. He wouldn't even accept money. I insisted. He just smiled and said, someone needed help. That, my dear family, is called character. Something money can't buy and breeding can't fake. She turned to Jake again. I didn't know who you were. I had no idea you were dating my granddaughter. But I liked you instantly because you reminded me of the kind of men this family used to be proud of. Caroline, who had been quiet through most of the dinner, finally stood up and walked over to Jake's side. Her eyes were shining, and for the first time all evening, she looked completely unafraid. This is why I love him, she said firmly, looking directly at her mother. Not because of his job or what he wears, but because of what he does when no one is watching. Her mother opened her mouth to respond, but Evelyn cut her off. Don't you dare say a word, Marianne. You've spent this entire evening embarrassing yourself. And I won't allow you to poison another good man out of our family because he doesn't come from your list of approved zip codes. Caroline's father looked like he wanted to disappear into his Scotch glass. The servants had all quietly retreated from the room, and the air felt charged, like a thunderstorm had passed through. Evelyn stepped closer to Jake and took his hand gently. I know this family can be a lot, but you've got grit and kindness and heart, and I'd be proud to call you family. Jake nodded slowly, emotion catching in his throat. Thank you, ma'am, he said, his voice low. Evelyn turned to the table and picked up her gloves. Now, if anyone wants to finish this lovely duck without choking on their own arrogance, I suggest we start treating each other with basic human decency. With that, she walked calmly out of the dining room, her heels clicking like punctuation marks on the hardwood floor. For a moment, no one moved. Then Caroline's mother stood, her face flushed with a cocktail of fury and humiliation, and without a word, she left the room as well. Caroline squeezed Jake's hand. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't know she was coming. Jake smiled faintly. I'm glad she did. Her father sighed, leaned back in his chair and muttered, Well, she's not wrong. He looked up at Jake, this time with something that resembled actual respect. You want a drink? Jake chuckled softly. I think I've earned one. The rest of the evening unfolded with a kind of strange calm, like the eye of a storm after the winds have passed but before the damage is fully realized. Caroline and Jake sat closer now, their bond somehow more visible, more unshakable. Her father, perhaps out of guilt or perhaps because Evelyn's words still echoed in his ears. Kept the conversation surprisingly neutral, asking Jake about his business in a tone that lacked the earlier venom. Jake answered honestly, not embellishing anything, just describing how he'd built his contracting company from the ground up, how he loved creating something useful with his hands, and how no amount of money could replace the satisfaction he felt when a client was happy. Caroline's father nodded occasionally, still sipping his drink but no longer with that air of superiority. When the meal ended, Jake offered to help clean up, which earned a quick, "That's not necessary," from the butler, and a faint, surprised smile from Caroline's father. The moment outside, as Jake and Caroline stood by his truck under the dim glow of the driveway lanterns, felt oddly peaceful. "You were amazing," she said, her voice full of admiration. "I was ready to scream at them, but you just stayed calm. I don't know how you do it." Jake looked at her and smiled. "I've handled worse. Rotten porches are nothing compared to rich people with rotten attitudes." She laughed, then stepped forward and hugged him tightly. "You didn't just win me over tonight. You won her, and that's almost impossible." Jake pulled back slightly. "I still can't believe she was your grandmother." Caroline nodded. "We don't talk about her much. My mom cut her off years ago, said she was too blunt, too unpredictable. But I always liked her. I used to visit her in secret when I was a kid." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You visited your grandma in secret? That says a lot about your mom." "Yeah," Caroline said with a small sigh. "She's always cared about appearances. And now that Grandma Evelyn embarrassed her in her own dining room, she'll probably hold a grudge until Christmas. But honestly, it was worth it." The next few days brought a slow but noticeable shift. Evelyn, true to form, sent Jake a handwritten thank you note in elegant cursive. In it she wrote, "Don't ever let this world shame you for being good. That's how the bad ones win." Caroline's father, while not exactly warm, did begin to send occasional texts, asking about home renovations and advice on foundation repairs. Her mother stayed silent for a while, licking her wounds and nursing her pride. But eventually, she sent Caroline a passive-aggressive message that said, "I suppose I overreacted. He's decent, I'll give you that." Caroline read the message aloud to Jake, who just laughed. "Decent is probably the best I'll get from her." "From her?" Caroline said, wrapping her arms around him. "You already got the best from the one who matters." A month later, Jake was invited back, this time for Evelyn's birthday, which she insisted on celebrating at the mansion, just to keep things spicy. The event was awkward at first, especially with Marianne pretending to be perfectly civil while obviously still fuming beneath the surface. But Evelyn was in her element. She told the porch story to every guest, painting Jake as a hero, a gentleman, and the only man here who knows the difference between a Phillips and a flathead. Jake didn't mind. He'd been through worse. And now, he had something better than approval. He had earned respect. More importantly, he had proven something to himself. That doing the right thing, even when it costs you, is never truly wasted. Sometimes, it even brings everything full circle. The man who was almost rejected by a family for being late and dirty was now their silent example of integrity. And the woman he helped, with her porch and her pride intact, had given him the ultimate gift. Validation that character still mattered in a world obsessed with image. That night, as he and Caroline drove home under a sky full of stars, she turned to him and whispered, "I think Grandma Evelyn loves you more than she loves me." Jake smirked. "Well, I did fix her porch. What have you done for her lately?" They both laughed, and the sound of it drifted out the windows and into the quiet night, full of relief, gratitude, and something else, something deeper. The kind of laughter that comes when the worst is over and life finally makes sense. Weeks passed, and although things with Caroline's parents were still a work in progress, Jake felt the shift every time he saw them. There were no more passive insults or sarcastic remarks at dinner. Caroline's father actually invited Jake to help him pick out new flooring for the guest house, clearly impressed by his knowledge, though he never admitted it outright. Marianne, still proud and distant, made only the most superficial attempts at kindness, offering tepid coffee and forced smiles. But Jake didn't mind. He hadn't done any of it for her approval. Evelyn, on the other hand, became a regular part of their lives. She would drop by Jake's workshop unannounced, bringing cookies or old blueprints for antique furniture she wanted him to replicate. She sat for hours watching him work, reminiscing about her late husband, who had also been a builder. She told Jake stories about the family's past, how they once valued hard work before money, and image replaced meaning. Jake grew to love those visits. Caroline often joined, sitting beside Evelyn, soaking up the rare family peace. One afternoon, while they were all sipping iced tea on Evelyn's newly reinforced porch, she turned to Jake and said, "You know, Marianne wasn't always this way. She used to be kind, curious, even a little wild. Then she married into money, and everything changed. I lost my daughter to a lifestyle. But maybe, through you, I've gained something back." Jake didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to that kind of emotion from people outside Caroline. He just nodded, a lump forming in his throat. Evelyn reached over and patted his knee. "You're part of this family now, whether she likes it or not, and I'm not going anywhere." That same week, Jake's business picked up. Evelyn had talked about him at her bridge club, which apparently included half the neighborhood's HOA chairs and 3 retired architects. Suddenly, Jake had more renovation requests than he could handle. People wanted him not just for his skills, but for his story, the man who helped an old woman and changed a family. It became a sort of legend among the locals, the kind of tale that people whispered with admiration over garden fences and charity luncheons. Jake hired a small crew, trained them carefully, and expanded his services. He didn't change his prices. He didn't move into a fancy office. He just kept doing what he did best, showing up, working hard, treating people with respect. One day, while reviewing blueprints at home, Jake got a call from Marianne. It was unexpected and awkward. She asked if he could stop by the house, alone. Curious and a little wary, he agreed. When he arrived, she was in the backyard garden, pruning roses. She didn't look at him right away. "I wanted to say, thank you," she said quietly, "for what you did for my mother and for Caroline." Jake waited. It was the first time she'd addressed him without a tone of superiority. "I may never fully understand why you'd choose this life, but I can't deny what it's done for us." Jake replied softly, "It's not a choice for me. It's who I am." She finally met his eyes. "I know. I just hope one day I can see it as clearly as my mother does." She didn't apologize. Not directly. But Jake didn't need her to. Some things are better understood in actions than in words. He left that day feeling lighter, like another wall had cracked. Caroline was waiting for him on the porch when he returned. He sat beside her, looked out at the setting sun, and said, "Your mom's trying." Caroline raised an eyebrow. "Really?" He nodded, in her own complicated way. Caroline smiled. "Then maybe there's hope for all of us." Jake reached over and took her hand. "We've already got the best part." And as the sky turned orange and the cicadas began to hum, Jake realized that sometimes the smallest decisions, a delay, a repair, a choice to help, can trigger the biggest changes. He hadn't just fixed a porch that day. He'd rebuilt bridges long thought burned, redefined what it meant to belong, and shown a world obsessed with appearances what real worth looked like. Not bad for a guy with sawdust in his hair. Months passed, and life settled into a new rhythm. One where Jake no longer felt like an outsider in Caroline's world. He was still the same man, still wearing jeans smeared with paint, still carrying his toolbox like a badge of honor. But now, when he entered her parents' mansion, it was without the weight of judgment pressing on his back. Caroline's father began asking Jake to explain how things worked around the house, how to fix a leaky faucet, how to reinforce aging beams, even how to choose durable tile. Jake noticed how these requests became less about the tasks and more about sharing time, building a fragile but growing sense of trust. Evelyn remained the heart of it all, her presence a kind of living reminder of the moment everything changed. She made it a point to include Jake in every family event, introducing him to distant relatives, always with the story of the porch. "You know," she'd begin with a wink, "if it weren't for a few rotted planks and one decent man, we'd still be pretending everything was fine." People would laugh. But beneath that laughter was something deeper, respect, maybe even admiration. Jake learned how to navigate the upper-crust world with Caroline by his side, but he never let it change him. He still drove his beat-up truck, still treated every client with the same attention, whether they lived in a penthouse or a trailer. But something had shifted within him. Not pride, exactly, but confidence. He no longer felt like he had to prove himself. He had done that already, in the most unexpected way. One cool Saturday morning, Evelyn invited Jake to join her on a walk through the local park. She was slower now, using a cane more frequently, but her spirit was as sharp as ever. As they strolled beneath the autumn leaves, she turned to him and said, "You know why I came to that dinner that night?" Jake looked at her curious. "Because I helped you?" Evelyn shook her head. "No, dear. I didn't know who you were when I arrived. I came because I heard my daughter was tearing apart another good relationship. I wanted to see for myself. When I saw your truck in the driveway, the same one that had been parked outside my house earlier that day, I knew the universe had brought you back into my path for a reason." Jake was silent for a moment, absorbing that. "I thought you just wanted to call her out." Evelyn chuckled. "Oh, I did. But I also wanted her to see what I saw. That love isn't about polish or pedigree. It's about the quiet, decent choices we make when nobody's watching." She paused, catching her breath. "And you, my dear, make the right choices. That's rare. That's valuable." Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak. They finished their walk in silence, a comfortable, knowing kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. Later that week, Caroline's mother, still stiff, still guarded, invited Jake to a charity fundraiser. It was the first time she had done so directly. Caroline raised an eyebrow when she told him. "You don't have to go," she said. "She's probably just trying to parade you around now that Grandma made you famous." Jake smiled. "Maybe, but I think I will go. Might be fun to wear the blazer again." Caroline laughed, "As long as there's no sawdust on it this time." The event was glitzy and full of people who barely looked up from their champagne flutes, but Jake handled it with grace. He chatted about roofing and wood types, and by the end of the night, he had 3 new business cards and a very flustered socialite asking if he made custom bookshelves. Marianne introduced him to the board members with a polite smile, and while her tone was formal, there was a subtle shift in her demeanor. Less icy, more careful, respectful even. After the fundraiser, as Jake and Caroline walked to the car, she leaned into him. "You've changed everything, you know that?" He looked at her, surprised. "I just fixed a porch." She smiled. "Exactly, and in doing that, you fixed something in all of us." Jake held her hand tighter. "I didn't plan any of it." "No," she said. "But maybe that's the best part." It was nearly a year after that first disastrous dinner when the entire family gathered again, this time not for confrontation, but for a celebration. Evelyn had decided to host a garden party at her restored cottage to mark her 80th birthday, and she insisted it be casual, full of laughter and open to anyone who brought good energy. Jake arrived early with Caroline to help set things up, moving tables, stringing lights across the trees, and double-checking the porch steps, now freshly painted, as solid as ever. As guests began to arrive, so did the stories. Evelyn floated from group to group, retelling the tale of the porch to anyone who hadn't heard it or needed to hear it again. Jake didn't mind. He stood by the grill, flipping burgers and chatting with Caroline's cousins, who now treated him like an old friend. Even Marianne was there, dressed in a simple floral blouse, her makeup subtle for once, her manner quieter than usual. She approached Evelyn in the shade of the garden and handed her a small, carefully wrapped box. Evelyn opened it slowly and smiled. Inside was a framed photo of the newly rebuilt porch, taken from the angle where the sun lit up the fresh wood and the shadows curved just right. A brass plaque at the bottom read, "For the foundation we rebuilt, literally and otherwise." Evelyn looked up, surprised. "You made this?" Marianne nodded. "Jake gave me the idea. Said the best builds always start with strong footings. I thought maybe we could use more of those." Evelyn chuckled, then hugged her daughter tightly. For a moment, the years of cold distance melted away, replaced by something tentative but real. Jake, watching from a distance, saw the exchange and felt something in his chest loosen. A knot he hadn't realized was still there. Later in the afternoon, Evelyn called everyone's attention. Standing on the now famous porch, she tapped her glass gently. "I want to say something before the cake," she announced. "Not about my age or how to survive this many years without murdering your relatives, though that's a valid topic." Laughter rippled through the crowd. "I want to talk about how everything you see here, this house, this garden, this porch, was saved by a stranger who didn't know who I was, didn't ask for anything, and still gave me more than I could repay. And in doing so, he reminded my daughter, and maybe even myself, what truly matters in this life." She looked at Jake. "Character is what you are when nobody's looking. And Jake showed me character when he thought no one would ever remember. But I remembered, and I will never forget." The guests clapped, and Jake, not one for public attention, simply raised his glass and gave a humble nod. Caroline leaned in and whispered, "I swear she loves you more than she loves me." Jake laughed. "She's got great taste." As the sun dipped behind the trees and the sky turned golden, Jake stood with his arm around Caroline and looked out over the garden full of people who had once doubted him, ignored him, or outright insulted him. Now they were here, celebrating the very qualities they once dismissed. All because he'd stopped for someone in need. He didn't fix that porch for thanks or recognition. He did it because it was the right thing to do. And somehow that simple act of decency had triggered a ripple of transformation through an entire family. The garden filled with music, laughter, and the clink of glasses. Children played on the lawn. Marianne sat beside Evelyn, both smiling at nothing in particular. Caroline leaned her head on Jake's shoulder, and for a moment, time seemed to pause. It was peaceful, whole, and honest. Everything Jake had hoped for when he first walked into that mansion, only to be met with disdain. He had come a long way since then, not by changing who he was, but by holding on to it. He hadn't conquered the family. He had changed it. Quietly, brick by brick, word by word, gesture by gesture. As the evening wore on and the garden lights twinkled like low-hanging stars, Jake found himself back on the porch, the one that had started it all, standing alone for a moment with a cold drink in his hand and 1,000 thoughts running quietly through his mind. He traced his fingers along the wood grain of the railing, remembering every board he'd replaced, every nail he'd hammered that day. It felt like a lifetime ago, yet the details were vivid. The urgency in the old woman's voice, the sharp crack of the collapsing plank, the sweat dripping into his eyes as he worked. At the time, he had no idea the woman he was helping would become the catalyst for the most unexpected turn in his life. He didn't know her name, her family, or what that porch would come to symbolize. He just knew someone needed help, and he could give it. That choice had come from instinct, from the same inner compass that had guided him through years of hard work, quiet dignity, and doing what needed to be done even when no one was looking. Behind him, the sounds of the party floated on the breeze. Evelyn's delighted laugh, Caroline's voice, singing softly along to the music, the clatter of plates and stories being exchanged. Jake looked over his shoulder and saw them, his girlfriend standing with her cousins, smiling like she belonged. Evelyn dancing slowly with one of her grandsons, Marianne sitting off to the side, sipping tea and observing the scene with a look that almost bordered on contentment. It was surreal, in a quiet, grounding way. He'd once thought of this family as a wall he'd never break through. Now, it felt like a house he had helped rebuild, not by force, but by example. He didn't confront them with arguments or accusations. He simply lived with integrity, and they had come to see it for what it was, unshakable, honest, and deeply rooted. Caroline soon joined him on the porch, slipping her hand into his. "You okay?" she asked gently. Jake smiled. "Yeah, just thinking how this porch has better social power than a whole season of country club brunches." She laughed. "Maybe we should start a new tradition. Porch diplomacy." Jake raised his glass. "I'd run for office on that platform." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You changed everything, you know that?" Jake looked out over the garden again, then down at their hands, fingers interlocked. "I didn't change anything," he said softly. "I just reminded them who they used to be." Caroline didn't respond right away. She just held his hand tighter. They stood like that for a while, letting the cool night air settle around them like a blanket. There were no grand speeches left to make, no final confrontations, just the quiet knowledge that a single act of decency, one small, inconvenient decision to stop and help, had rewired an entire family's trajectory. And that was the thing about real change, Jake realized. It rarely comes loud and dramatic. It comes in sawdust and sweat, in handshakes and glances, in quiet consistency that refuses to bow to cynicism. Evelyn soon wandered over, her cane tapping softly against the wooden boards. "Well, here we are," she said with a smile. "The porch that changed the world." Jake grinned. "That's a bit dramatic, don't you think?" Evelyn shrugged. "Not at all. For you, it was a small repair. For the rest of us, it was a full renovation of the heart." Carolyn chuckled. "Grandma, that's either incredibly poetic or the name of your next memoir." Evelyn winked. "Both." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in tissue paper. "I've been meaning to give you this," she said to Jake. He opened it carefully. Inside was a small brass key, old and polished by time. "That was your grandfather's," Evelyn explained. "He used it to lock his workshop. He was a man like you. Quiet, kind, always fixing what no one else noticed was broken. I think he'd like you." Jake swallowed hard, touched beyond words. "Thank you," he managed to say. Evelyn patted his arm. "Now keep fixing things, Jake. Not just porches. Hearts, too." He nodded, slipping the key into his pocket like a sacred token. As Evelyn walked back inside, Jake looked at Caroline, who was watching him with quiet pride. "You ready to go?" he asked. She smiled. "Yeah, but let's come back tomorrow. I like this porch." Jake looked down at the boards beneath their feet, strong, sturdy, weathered, just enough to feel real. "Me too," he said. Then they stepped down together, hand in hand, into the future they had helped rebuild, one quiet, powerful gesture at a time. In the weeks that followed Evelyn's party, Jake noticed something subtle but meaningful changing in his day-to-day life. Not just in the way Caroline's family now treated him, with a newfound, if sometimes clumsy, respect, but in how he carried himself. He felt more rooted, more certain of who he was, and not because he had proven anything to anyone, but because he had watched the ripple effect of quiet decency unfold in ways he never could have predicted. One evening, while he was closing up the workshop, an envelope slid under the door. It was from Marianne. Inside was a simple note, handwritten with precise, careful lettering. It read, "Thank you for rebuilding more than wood and nails. You reminded me what I forgot to value. I hope we can start over. M." Jake read it twice, then tucked it away without a word. He didn't need a big apology. That letter was enough. People rarely changed overnight, but this was a beginning. Caroline smiled when he showed it to her. "That's basically her version of an emotional sonnet," she joked, and Jake chuckled. "I'll take it." Business continued to grow, and so did Jake's reputation. Clients often greeted him with a version of, "You're the porch guy, right?" It had become a local legend, the man who showed up late to a fancy dinner because he chose to help a stranger. But instead of being mocked, the story was celebrated, told as a parable of integrity in an age too often obsessed with appearances. Schools invited him to talk to vocational students. One high school even asked if he'd mentor a few seniors interested in trades. Jake agreed, a little reluctantly at first, but quickly realized how fulfilling it was to pass on what he knew. He didn't see himself as a hero, just someone who stuck to what he believed in. But to those students, his story was proof that character mattered. One afternoon, while teaching a teenager how to measure and level a beam, Jake caught sight of Caroline sitting on the tailgate of his truck, waving at him. She had brought lunch, as she often did now, and wore that look of quiet admiration that still caught him off guard. When the student left for the day, she joined Jake by the workbench. "You know, if you ever wanted to run workshops full-time, I bet people would sign up in droves," she said. Jake raised an eyebrow. "And give up crawling under decks and patching leaky ceilings? Sounds too easy." She laughed. "I'm serious. People respect you, Jake. They trust you. You don't just fix things, you teach people how to care." Jake looked at her thoughtfully. "Maybe one day. For now, I still like the dust." She kissed him on the cheek and nodded. "Fair, but just know, you've built more than homes. You've built trust, and that's harder than any porch." That night, Evelyn called to tell Jake she was adding his name to her will. Not for the money, but for the workshop tools that once belonged to her husband. "You've earned them," she said, "and I can't think of anyone else who would use them with such care." Jake was speechless. Those tools were decades old, passed down through generations, and carried stories in every groove and scratch. He thanked her, but what he really felt was a deep, humbling sense of belonging. This family, once a fortress of judgment, had become a circle of growth. They hadn't changed because of pressure. They'd changed because someone reminded them what values really look like. Jake had never shouted to be heard. He had simply shown up and done the right thing, again and again, and that quiet, unwavering consistency had spoken louder than any speech or argument ever could. He stood on Evelyn's porch one last time that season before the cold set in, watching leaves fall across the lawn like golden confetti. The wood beneath his boots was strong, weathered, and unshakable, just like the bond he had formed with the people around him. And as he looked toward the future, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: character builds everything. It was nearly a full year since that fateful evening when Jake first walked into Caroline's parents' mansion, late, dirty, and unwelcome. As the anniversary of that dinner approached, Evelyn decided to host a quiet gathering, just the immediate family, a sort of symbolic full circle, one last reminder of where they had been and how far they had come. The plan was simple: dinner on the porch Jake had rebuilt, the same boards that had held their weight through storms and celebrations alike. Jake arrived early, as he always did now, with a homemade pie in one hand and a toolkit in the other, just in case anything needed tightening. He wasn't treated like an outsider anymore. No one questioned his place at the table. Marianne greeted him with a genuine nod, and even offered him a cup of tea while he checked the railings. Her tone was still reserved, but her eyes had softened, and that was enough. Evelyn was already seated in her favorite rocking chair, wrapped in a thick knit shawl. She looked up and smiled when Jake approached. "Well," she said, "it's held up beautifully, hasn't it?" Jake nodded. "Stronger than ever." "Like us," she added. "Stronger than ever, and not a single nail wasted." Caroline arrived shortly after, her hand slipping naturally into Jake's as they joined the others around the long outdoor table Evelyn had set with mismatched china and flickering candles. It wasn't a fancy dinner. It was honest, warm, and filled with simple food and quieter conversation. Caroline's father asked Jake about a roofing project he was overseeing. Marianne shared a story about a neighbor who now referred to Jake as the fixer with a heart. Evelyn raised a toast midway through the meal, her voice steady and clear. "To kindness," she said, "and to the man who showed us that helping a stranger isn't an inconvenience. It's a privilege." Everyone raised their glasses. Jake, embarrassed but touched, simply murmured, "Thank you." After dessert, the group lingered, sipping coffee and listening to the sounds of the evening. Crickets chirped, wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, there was only peace. Caroline leaned over and whispered, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that day?" Jake looked out over the yard, the fading light casting long shadows across the grass. "Sometimes," he said, "but I don't think I could have done anything different. That's just who I am." She smiled. "I know. And that's why everything changed." As the night wound down, people began to drift inside, but Jake stayed behind, standing once more on the porch that had become so much more than a structure. It was a symbol of everything he believed in: stability, integrity, the quiet kind of strength that holds everything together when no one else notices. He touched the railing one last time, as if to thank it for all it had given back. From that one act, an unplanned stop, a stranger in need, had come a chain of events that redefined relationships, healed wounds, and rebuilt not just a porch, but a legacy. Jake didn't need recognition, didn't crave applause. What he had was far more valuable. The quiet knowledge that when the world had offered him a test, he answered it not with words or excuses, but with action. And that action, done without expectation, had spoken volumes. He stepped off the porch and walked toward Caroline, who waited at the edge of the garden path. She looked back at him with that same unwavering expression she'd worn the night everything had turned, the night she stood beside him in defiance of everything her family once valued. They walked away together, hand in hand, toward a future they hadn't planned but had built together, one nail, one step, one act of courage at a time. Because in the end, the real strength of a man isn't measured by what he owns but by what he's willing to give, even when no one's watching.